Thank you, Aziz, and also thanks to the Emirates Detainees Advocacy Center for initiating the Sanad campaign. And I think that's really a great opportunities for different actors to come together and work together on trying to increase the pressures and get ultimately to reform the human rights situation in the UAE and to help release prisoners of conscience. I will try to speak a little bit about the role of the international community, but also to kind of place what's happening in the UAE in a bit of a regional context where maybe we can also find solution to some of the problems. The UAE is often referred to or considered as a beacon of stability in the region, with places like Dubai being a big economic hub, and over the last years, Abuظbي having been developed as a cultural center with prestigious secondary brands of museums and universities. And they've also been very successful in attracting tourism and international events such as the World Tolerance Summit, the Hay Festival, the Expo, as was mentioned, the upcoming COP28. So the UAE have been really successful in kind of presenting a shiny image for themselves, and have also very early on cracked down on any peaceful dissent and really managed to fully silence any critical civil society, which then really only left the state narrative, to be spread. This is, I think, where we're really talking about a difficult context in the UAE, because they have been successful in sharing that kind of image and creating, as I said, also sort of economic incentives for a lot of foreign businesses to operate tax-free or semi-tax-free, and that's obviously also in the interest of a lot of states to have, their companies go in the UAE. If we look at now sort of the regional context, the UAE is not an isolated case. We see a lot of shared malpractices or patterns all throughout the region. Many of the colleagues have mentioned them. They include the anti-terrorism and cybercrime law to crack down on any peaceful dissent. They include the use of the revocation of nationality for dissidents and their families, the imposition of travel bans, also as like measures of reprisals, and the detention of prisoners of conscience in terrorism rehabilitation centers beyond the expiry of their actual sentence. And I think what they also all use is a narrative of reform and progress in a way. On the one hand, to like weaken social movements, but also to try to appease international allies, while they're failing to really implement any kind of sufficient reform, or definitely not a human rights reform. Now, what has been done by the international community over the past years, I think we need to kind of differentiate a little bit who we're talking about in the international community. If we look at multilateral actors such as the UN or the EU, we actually do see that there were actions taken. We've seen quite a few resolutions of the European Parliament on the general situation, on the case of Ahmed Mansour, on the UAE's involvement in Yemen. We're also seeing regular communication by the UN special procedures on rights abuses by the UAE authorities. These complaints include or mention migrant workers, women's rights, prisoners of conscience, flawed legislation, and many others. But obviously that's not been enough. I mean, what we would really like to see, I think, is more pressure by international political stakeholders or businesses, because they have a lot of leverage and they have not really used that leverage sufficiently for us to be able to see those human rights defenders released from prison or or really structural human rights reform taking place in the UAE. But what can be done? I think we need to continue using existing mechanisms on the multilateral level, be that the UN treaty bodies, so the treaties that the UAE has ratified, they're being reviewed every few years by the committees of these treaties to see if there's any implementation, and there's pressure that can be exerted through this mechanism, and they're concluding observations that are usually quite strong, and we've seen this during the last review by the UN Committee on Torture last summer, that voiced, I think, a lot of harsh criticism on the practice of torture in the UAE, and made very strong recommendations of what would need to change to address these concerns, or continue sort of scrutiny on the level of the European Parliament. As I said, there have been resolutions. There need to be mechanisms to really follow up on the resolutions and the demands in these resolutions. On the EU level, there's also the EU human rights dialogue with the UAE, which has not proven to be the most successful mechanism, but it is available. Sort of civil society kind of can try and utilize that. And I think what's been quite useful, at least in the Saudi context, but I think in other contexts as well, is holding the authorities to their own promises. So one could do that also within the UN system, like with the Universal Periodic Review that is going to happen again in May of this year, whereby states make recommendations to the state under review as to how they could improve their human rights record. Then the states accepts or rejects these recommendations. And those that the UAE has accepted should also be implemented. So if we look at the last review, for example, they have accepted some recommendations to cooperate with the UN human rights mechanisms, including by positively responding to visit requests by special procedures mandate holders. They've also said that they will take further steps to ensure freedom of expression and association. I mean, these are kind of, the problem lies often in the fact that these are vague recommendations, and it's easy to accept vague recommendations because you can't really follow up on the progress made. And I think overall one has to say that also during the last UPR, the UAE didn't make a lot of important promises. So I would hope that during the coming review, that in the lead up to it, I know many of the partner organizations have submitted reports and are in the stage of doing lobbying with UN member states to ensure that these recommendations are strong, and that hopefully the UAE accepts as many as possible and then can be held to account for these promises made. Other things would also be, for example, the pledges, the voluntary pledges the UAE makes when it applies for membership on the Human Rights Council. There it has, for example, during its last election, pledged, I mean, I can kind of quote or read that. It says, with regard to cooperation with the Human Rights Council mechanisms, the United Arab Emirates attaches great importance to the work of the human rights mechanisms by submitting its periodic reports to various treaty bodies and pursuing the implementation of its recommendations. The UAE also supports the vital role of the special procedures and reiterates its eagerness to continue to cooperate with them as it has done in the past. So if you make a pledge like this, then you should be open to allowing international monitors into the country, to allow special procedures mandate holders that are critical to the human rights situation, such as the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders or torture or counterterrorism. There are plenty. And also allowing international NGO representatives to monitor the situation on the ground, which is sort of an impossibility today and over the past years. While the UN has been, I would say, quite active on the UAE, obviously more needs to be done, and pressure needs to be exerted by the international community. And that, I think, really includes a multitude of stakeholders. Like, this won't be done by just one of the many speaking out or changing their behavior, but this needs to be a big and exerted effort by civil society, by supportive media, by pressure from political stakeholders, by business stakeholders. But also, I mean, as I said, governments unfortunately are often also complicit and have their own interests in mind, having sort of a partner in the region that they can count on, that is considerably stable in a region that isn't very stable. But I mean, there are also other ways to shed light on the situation and to increase international pressure on the authorities. And I think that can be done not just by international governments, but it can be done by international members of parliaments, even opposition members of parliaments, by highlighting individual cases to their UAE counterparts, by offering parliamentary protection. I mean, there are programs such as in the German parliament for human rights defenders at risk, whereby a member of parliament can really take up an individual case and advocate for them. I think that's something we should look into also for UAE prisoners of conscience. And then there's ways for international civil society cooperation, highlighting individual cases and also suggesting people for awards, for example, or honorary citizenships, like we've seen from Ahmed Mansour in the city of Lyon. And I think we need to kind of campaign more and mobilize the general public. I find it really strange that given, the extent of the human rights abuses in the UAE, it is still like kind of a paradise for some people in terms of holiday. Like, why would you go on holiday to a country that is so repressive? And that, I mean, where practices like torture are institutionalized. Is this really, I mean, it's also a moral question, and it's a question that concerns a lot of people. So I think we need to, in our respective countries, also mobilize the general public to understand the severity of the situation and to help us put pressure on Western governments to increase the pressure on the UAE authorities. And I think regional cooperation is very important because there are so many similarities when it comes to the abuses in the region that I think we can only really successfully address them if we work together. I mean, there is sports washing, there is greenwashing. All of these things are being done by different governments in the region, and I think we civil society actors need to come together and address them jointly, try to build as many bridges as we can, and therefore I think it's also a really great moment to start the Senate campaign. Thank you.